Just to say, it's great to see everybody, and very nice to have you all with us for this philosophical afternoon. And as you all know, today we are going to dedicate 1 hour to discovering Epictetus. Why talking about Epictetus in today's times? It's a good question to start with. Have you ever thought about the fact that we keep coming back to the ancient philosophers, although we have clearly more modern thinkers? And this has always amazed me, that in the face of challenges of life, we seek advice in the practical and clear ideas of the ancient philosophers. And I thought it would be good perhaps to open this reflection. What is the difference between being merely a thinker and being a philosopher? Okay. So a thinker is somebody who, you could say, has an intellectual prowess, especially the one whose profession involves intellectual activity. However, to think doesn't necessarily imply to live or to live well, because a conscious intent is needed to bridge this distance between the ideas and my way of living, isn't it? Now, who is a philosopher? You could say that a philosopher is an individual who develops an intelligence and self-mastery that allows him or her to think and act in harmony with the timeless values that he or she has developed or discovered. So a philosopher is someone who searches for wisdom and is able to learn from everything in life, gradually getting to know oneself and to know the world that he or she is living in and its laws. And so what this implies, it is to live well, not only for ourselves, but also for the collective good. And you could say that it is an individual who is able to express will, love, and intelligence in their behavior, regardless of the circumstances of life. So as you can see, it doesn't only imply to think well, but also to live well. So, and to harmonize both aspects of our living. Epictetus was a philosopher. How much do we know about Epictetus? Well, not terribly much, but enough to understand that he was a remarkable individual who has impacted people in a very profound way. And who is actually still impacting us today. And he is one of those characters of humanity, or individuals from the history of humanity, that is an example how circumstances of life don't define us. From being a slave, he became one of the most famous philosophers of Stoic philosophy. Not that he wanted to be famous, but it turns out that he is. And when we think of Stoicism, he's probably the second person in mind, next to Marcus Aurelius, that we know. What he didn't do, he didn't dedicate his time to write down his teachings for posterity, because that wasn't his focus. Everything that we know was written down and recorded by one of his close disciples, Arian, in his and he compiled his teachings, or a portion of it, in the discourses or and Enchiridion. I'm probably not pronouncing this very well, but if you Google it, if you research it, you're going to find both books or both writings very easily. What I'm using today as a source for my talk today is the Art of Living. Can you see it? You have probably come across this book. It's a compilation and interpretation of Epictetus' teachings, or a part of it, by Sharon label, and it's quite good. It's quite well put together. The way Epictetus transmitted philosophy, it was done as it was done in the ancient times. It was very practical. It was through the art of living. And it wasn't simply the intellectual speculation. What is said about Epictetus is that he was a great orator, and that when he would give a lecture, at the end of it, people would feel like the lecture was about them. So he had such an art of transmitting these ideas in a way that people could recognize themselves in these timeless ideas of philosophy. And so you could say that the way of education, philosophical education, that he pursued was this transmission through the chain of master and disciple, a mentor and mentee, something that we are not very familiar today, but it was the way philosophy was transmitted in the ancient times. And what this implied is that both individuals were dedicating themselves to live these ideas practically, to experience them in the daily life, and not only to discover them theoretically, but ultimately what they were seeking is the wisdom that allows them to improve as human beings, and therefore to leave a positive impact in the world. To give you some, when I say that Epictetus is still quite present, even if we don't know it, if you have ever seen Gladiator, apparently Ridley Scott was quite inspired by Epictetus' teachings, and he used quite a lot of that to build a character, the main character of the movie. So let's take a moment to get to know the life of Epictetus, as well as the times he lived in. What we know is that he was born a slave, and actually his name means an acquired one. So he was born in Hierapolis, Phrygia, which today is called Pamukkale, Turkey, and around 50 AD. He lived in Rome until later in his life he was banished, and I'll mention a little bit more about that. What he was something that we today could call a white-collar slave. That is to say, white-collar slaves, you could imagine them as those were the ones that would be trained to become teachers, counselors, and administrators. But as a young character, he himself was quite bold, you could say, and for instance, he would go out into the streets and he would ask people just randomly if their souls are healthy. And if they wouldn't give him an answer, he would insist. And sometimes he would insist and get himself into trouble until people would wanted to even harm him. What we know is that he gained freedom after the death of the Emperor Nero. And as a free man, he's going to dedicate his life to philosophy. And later on, he's going to start a school of philosophy in Rome until he was banished along with other philosophers by the Emperor Domitian. Epictetus wanted his fellow students, his fellow philosophers, to understand two conditions of philosophy. And one was to have a deep need to benefit from philosophy, you could say, and to deeply understand the philosophical way of life, but also to understand what does it mean to live philosophically, and to understand what commitment does this entail. So his lectures were not simply dialectic lessons. Okay, they were rather an invitation to his audience to examine themselves. And he would use this analogy to explain what a school of philosophy would look like. And he would say a Stoic school should look like rather as a physician room or a physician consulting room. So to say the patient should leave rather feeling bad than feeling good. That is to say that a patient or a person should have discovered something something that has an impact on their own consciousness. And sometimes these things are not easy to accept. But anyhow, the person should have discovered something with more clarity in its all totality. So in his early life is when Epictetus discovers philosophy. And luckily, his wealthy owner allows him to study philosophy under Musonius Rufus, okay, who was also one of the famous Stoic philosophers, perhaps not so popularly known, but quite an intriguing character himself. When he was banished, along with all other philosophers from the city, Epictetus will move to Greece in Nicopolis, where he is going to found a school of philosophy and live, I believe, until the end of his life, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay. So what we know is that he lived a very frugal, very simple life with very few possessions. He lived alone for a long time, but in his old age, he decides to adopt a friend's child who otherwise would be left to die. And he's going to raise him with the aid of a woman. The timing of his death is around 135 AD. Okay. So what was Epictetus' concern and what human challenge is he addressing? Okay. What Epictetus was looking for is the pragmatic path to philosophy, okay, a way of life that brought together a reflection, an understanding of the world and the human nature, with how we apply that understanding in action. So he wasn't only concerned in understanding why, but also how can I live daily that which I have discovered, recognized, or understood to be good. While as a Stoic, he was deeply interested into logic and physics. What his focus mainly was, or mostly was cultivating the art of living that makes an individual stronger, morally stronger, and allows us to build a moral strength and resilience of character so we can welcome life in all its facets with tranquility. So he was interested in the art of living that allows us as human beings, as individuals, also to live in harmony with nature. And this is an idea that Epictetus comes back again and again and again. That we'll discover it a little bit more. And so through this process, also to progressively build ourselves build for ourselves and by ourselves the inner freedom and serenity, something that I believe we all seek for. There is a beautiful image that he uses in order to explain how he understands the art of living. And he compares it with a carpenter or a sculptor, interestingly enough. So he says that being a philosopher is not much different than being a carpenter or a sculptor of oneself. A carpenter works with wood, okay, shapes it with the mastery of his skill. It is the medium in which he expresses an idea, okay. And the same is with sculptor. His medium is bronze, that he or she is patiently and with determination shapes into a form that a sculptor has imagined. While the medium is different, the process is the same. It requires vision, determination, patience, effort, enthusiasm, love, in order to make what we have envisioned a masterpiece. And so you can imagine that not much is different with our life. And what Epictetus suggests is that our life becomes the medium on which we can practice the art of living. Quite a wonderful idea, quite a beautiful image. And to work with life in such a way that I'm able to improve as a human being. And so that I'm able to strengthen my character by awakening this latent potential of wisdom that is within me. And so with knowing myself and mastering myself, how can I become a more complete human being and therefore enter into more meaningful relationships with others in the world? And through this process of discovery and practice, he would say that we can experience a life that is filled with meaning and dignity. And so it enables us to build inner stability or tranquility, even in the hardships of life. So before we look into this more, let's stop to understand the bigger picture that Epictetus introduces us to. And that is our relationship with life and nature. And this is not only his vision, okay, but he brings it to the forefront quite determinedly. But also to something to keep in mind is that we find this view throughout history of humanity, because for the most of part of it, humanity had a very close relationship with nature and the surrounding world, but only perhaps in the past two centuries, we lose this intimate connection. And in practice, really, we don't consider ourselves as a part of a larger whole, be it a society, a collective, or a universe. And so you could say that our vision today has become somewhat fragmented. However, in the ancient civilizations, the view was that the human beings are part of life, that they are part of this large macrocosm that is living and is governed by the laws of life. So we as human beings are part of life, and that we are part of that mystery of life, and experience these laws of life within ourselves too. And so Epictetus would say, life is not a series of random, meaningless episodes, but an ordered, elegant whole that follows ultimately comprehensible laws. Okay. And so this starts to open up a new dimension and put things into a different perspective, doesn't it? And so it also sheds a different light on what I understand the source of my happiness and inner freedom is. So if we listen to Stoics and to Epictetus, is what they say is that what we have, whether it's the external positions or our skills, where we work, our social background, where we are from, our nationality, all of that is something that is secondary to my inner freedom and my happiness. Okay. What is truly needed is to see the world as an integrated whole and focus ourselves on that which is the highest good. And that for Epictetus was to adopt the will of nature as our own. And you probably are asking yourself, what does that mean for me today practically? Well, if I embrace the possibility that the laws of life exist, Epictetus would call it divine will or divine providence, I start understanding that, in the words of Epictetus, is that everything is governed with justice and goodness. That's what he would say. Okay? And therefore, I recognize that the same laws of life apply to my human nature and are governed by justice and goodness. And so you can see that that Epictetus, the Stoic philosophers, but in reality, all ancient philosophers of East and West rooted the human nature in the intelligence, justice, and goodness of nature. They would call it the higher self, or if we read Plato, he would call it the individual. But you can also call it the inner being. But what they were all trying is to use the words to express the reality or the inner condition of the human being that is in harmony with nature. Not that they didn't recognize that we have an ego, which they understood to be the seat of our desires, our challenges, our instincts and doubts. But what they refused is to identify human nature with that aspect of ourselves, which they consider to be the lower aspect of ourselves. The paragraph from Epictetus sums this quite well. So I will just read it out. Understand what freedom really is and how it is achieved. Freedom isn't the right or ability to do whatever you please. Freedom comes from understanding the limits of our own power and natural limits set in place by divine providence. By accepting life's limits, we said that by accepting the life's limits and inevitabilities and working with them rather than fighting them, we become free. If, on the other hand, we succumb to our passing desires for things that aren't in our control, freedom is lost. Okay. So I don't think that I have anything to add to this, but what he explains is that there is a necessity to understand what he says, the life's limits. So basically, and to align our objectives as human beings with the laws of life. Another benefit of seeing the world from this perspective is as well that it prompts us not to see the world from our point of view only, which is difficult, I know, I admit, but it is important because our views are not always right. And here we have a different movement that suggests there are timeless principles of life and intelligence that is inherent in life from which we can learn from. Okay. And so here we can recognize deeply inherent laws of life that we can perceive and understand as justice, harmony, goodness, beauty, that are applicable to human essence too. And so what Epictetus would suggest is that it's by anchoring ourselves and our actions in these principles, we start building a moral resilience to remain standing upright in the face of life. Now, on the surface of things, events, or our experiences, this is not immediately apparent. But if we anchor ourselves in these timeless ideals, and if we insist and persist, as he says, they will increasingly reveal themselves to us. And so, because we are going to be awakening them through our behavior, our actions, and something within us will resonate with these ideals in the world. So what we can perceive, like for instance, how do we connect with nature? We can perceive beauty in nature, but have you ever asked yourself why? It's because that beauty resonates with something that touches something that is deeply in us. We can connect with the wonders of nature because it is something that we recognize within ourselves, a sentiment or aspiration, a potential, something within us vibrates because it's a part of us. Now, what is important is not only to experience it, to be mesmerized by it, but when it is to learn to voluntarily choose to live these ideals consciously, and to direct our behaviors and aspirations towards this highest good. And so daily, we can ask ourselves the question, how can I harmonize my will with nature as my utmost ideal? It's a different insight. What is the meaning? So you could ask this question differently. What is the meaning of things, and what is the most meaningful thing for me to do right now? The first principle that we need to understand, according to Epictetus, is that some things are within my control and some things are not. Okay. And that is quite essential for us to learn to distinguish what I can and cannot do, or what I can and cannot control, and apply it to my life. When we don't have this determination, it is impossible to have the inner tranquility and outer effectiveness. Okay. But if I learn to discern what is within my control and what is not, then I will be able to go to build the inner serenity and be able to effectively live the ideals that are meaningful to me. And so what is within my control? What is always within my control is who I am and how I respond to what is happening to me. What Epictetus says is that we always have a choice about the content and the character of our inner life. And this is probably the premise or the idea that we mostly connect with Stoicism, but above all with Epictetus. For him, this individual freedom and happiness is impossible if we don't learn to discern what is within my control and what is not. And above all, to follow through on this in my actions. That is to say, to live this. That which is within my control, who I am, my identity, and how I react and respond to life, or you could say it differently, that which is essential within the human being is naturally at my disposal at any time. And so it is related to this philosophical ideal of self-knowledge and self-mastery, and that is who I want to be and become at my essence, at my core. And you can understand this process as developing an inner perspective, step by step, because knowing ourselves and mastering ourselves is a task of a lifetime. That's why step by step. So in the day-to-day dealings, we can ask ourselves, what is my focus today? Am I focused on that which is within my power, or on that which I have no control of? Because if we are constantly pursuing and work on that which is outside of my control, we eventually become drained and frustrated with life, with world, with others, and we start blaming others for problems we have. But in reality, it is not their problem. The problem is within the inner outlook that we have. So what is within my control is my state of mind and the values I hold. It is my character, my ideals, and this is nothing new that I'm saying. Okay, we are all familiar with this as well, that when we are faced with the events, it is not that events themselves frighten us, but our perceptions and our anticipation of the outcomes anticipation of their outcomes that does frighten us. Either because we desire a certain outcome or are afraid not to get a certain result, we hesitate and retrieve ourselves in front of life. Or alternatively, we become aggressive in front of the complexity and uncertainty of life. The perspective that Epictetus brings about is that we can engage, and it's not only can, we actually should, engage with life from the point of view of what I understand are my true aspirations and ideals, and engage with adversities of life with that inner perspective. And he would say, attach yourself to what is spiritually superior, regardless of what other people think or do. So hold your true aspirations, no matter what is going on around you. So one thing, when we accept this different outlook, or when we build this inner perspective, that's probably the better way of explaining it, is one thing will fundamentally change. Our perceptions of our circumstances, of others, the world, and ultimately of ourselves. And I love the way Epictetus transmits and introduces this attitude to life. He's very clear about this, that there is a necessity to develop this inner perspective and to be clear about who we want to be and become and the values that we stand for. Developing this inner perspective, you could imagine it as learning how to dance with life. Just to give an image, okay? If we don't know how to dance, right? We don't know how to dance, if we don't know the method, and you could say, just to connect it, the laws of dancing are, we're probably going to end up being a poor dancing couple, me and life, right? And so what is going to happen is that we are going to trip over each other's toes, and we're probably going to complain about life constantly stepping on our feet, quite painfully, okay, and quite annoyingly. And we are going to suffer through the process of dancing quite a lot. But there is a different alternative. And that alternative is, I can learn how to dance. Okay. I can understand what is necessary. I could understand the natural limits of dancing. And then through learning how to dance, that is to say, to master myself, I can connect with life in a more harmonious way. One thought that Epictetus shares, an insight rather than just a thought, is that the universe that we live in and the circumstances that happen to us are the best circumstances that we need. So to say is, we live in the best possible universe that is necessary for me. Okay. He suggests that our circumstances of life, whether we like them or not, that's a different matter, right? You can embrace them, envision them as a good wrestling partner, a good competitor that helps us to bring out the best in us. Okay, and he's not talking about physical strength or endurance, but about inner strength and resilience of character that we all have, but mostly in potential. So every day, from the very beginning, we could ask ourselves, we could prepare ourselves to have a good match, so to say, with the circumstances of life, with ourselves above all. Not with an intent to win, because that will bring much more frustrations, but with an intent to test ourselves and test our ability to live the values we have practically. Okay, so to prove to ourselves to what extent can I live my life in harmony with the values that I hold. Okay, so to give you some examples is we can ask ourselves and test ourselves to what extent I was able to restrain myself in a difficult conversation, for instance. Or was my decision or speech just? Did I bring a little bit more beauty and harmony within myself, with others, or in my environment? Was I compassionate or understanding at that particular time, etc.? But you can find your own examples, right? Something that is meaningful to you. Or if you're not a wrestler, you can find a different image of a different sports that you connect with. For instance, if you're sailing, well, you can imagine life as like a sailing. It is how do I learn as a human being to navigate the storms of life with courage and intelligence? Yeah. Because one thing fundamentally is what Epictetus explains is that circumstances arise not to meet our expectations. Okay. And in any event, however seemingly dire, there is nothing to prevent us from searching for its hidden opportunity. And if we don't, he said, it's a failure of our imagination. And this pretty much can sum up as well a philosophical attitude in general. It is to have the courage, the openness of mind and heart to learn from all circumstances of life. Okay, to find something that is positive that can help me ennoble myself. Okay, but for this I have to have a deep desire and courage to improve and transform. Okay, and consciously choose to, if I could say it this way, inform my decisions and actions with the principles of life. That is to say, stoically, it is to live a good life. Okay? And not only for ourselves, but also for others, because we have accepted the responsibility for others and nature. Because remember, we are a part of life. To give this direction to ourselves, it is necessary to define clearly what I identify with as an individual or a human being. Epictetus says, stop being vague when you're defining your aspiration of who you want to be and become. And again, this is not about your profession or what you would like to do, but more about who you want to be and become as a human being. Okay, so what he reminds us is to stop being vague about who we want to be and become and about our profound values. Because if we don't have this clearly in front of us, what happens to us, we lose ourselves in the appearances of things. And this is a known human dilemma, which always brings us back to this question of who I am and what I stand for. Because if we don't have a clear vision where we are going, who we want to be and become, what happens to us is we get distracted, so to say, by the superficial appearances of things. And often we feel all over the place. And you could imagine this to understand the difference between the two attitudes is like walking in a dark forest. Okay, when you have a compass with you, it can help you navigate the unknown terrain of the forest in the night, because you know where you are going, towards the north, right? But if you don't have the compass, and if unfortunately it's a cloudy night so you can't see the stars, it is very difficult to navigate this unknown terrain with confidence. And with ourselves it's the same. When we lack this moral compass, the ideals in life, this sense and sentiment of identity, well, it's quite difficult to make choices And we become indecisive in the face of life and overwhelmed by the complexity of life. And so what is necessary for us, for human beings, is to anchor ourselves in the values and ideals that we have. And we are going to see that a lot of our dilemmas and problems and questions are going to disappear. And, you know, it's also important to say that this is not a one-off exercise, but a lifetime marathon. Because to build ourselves, it takes time, okay? Like the sculptor needs time to build a statue. And also, it becomes necessary to accept the natural frictions of life that comes with knowing ourselves and natural friction with the world. Why do I say in knowing ourselves? Because in this process of discovery of who we are and who we want to be and become, we're going to discover the tremendous potential of humanity that is within us. That's one side. But we are also going to discover a number of things that we need to improve, because we are not complete human beings. And these things are not always easy to accept, okay? And why do I say we are going to have a natural friction with others? Because we have to accept that not everybody that surrounds us is going to share the same ideals. And yet to retain our direction, our compass, our courage to live these ideals, it's very important. Okay. What is also necessary to mention is that we will also require some strength to let go of some things that we are attached to, but that don't support our values. We are not going to be able to please everyone, for instance. Certain things that we thought are essential, we are going to recognize them progressively as not, but rather as superficial. And Epictetus gives us an advice here, is to understand that while it won't be easy, and we will have to give up some things entirely and postpone others for now, ultimately this process will lead us to the inner freedom and serenity. Okay. The other alternative is that we focus constantly on the things that are outside of our control, which eventually will lead us to frustration and anxiety. So what is outside of my control? I think as well that that's one, it's easy. For instance, what life brings to us, it's outside of my control. And therefore, Epictetus advises not to complain about it. I know it's not so simple. He also reminds us that often it's not a problem of the events that happen to us, but rather the perceptions that we hold of them that troubles us. What he says here is things themselves don't hurt us or hinder us, nor do other people. How we view these things is another matter. It is our attitudes and reactions that give us trouble. The more we examine our attitudes and work on ourselves, the less we are apt to be swept away by stormy emotional reactions in which we seek easy explanations for unbidden events. Okay. So he advises to examine our perceptions, examine our consciousness, and to correct our inner positioning so that we can see things for what they are, and therefore that we can intelligently engage with life. And how can I practice this ideal? Well, he says, in all aspects of your life that are particular to you, right? With your uniquely personal tasks and duties, okay? So it's not so much about what you do, but how you do it, with what attitude. And when we properly understand this principle, while difficulties and challenges will arise, we will still make space for the inner peace, and it will, the tranquility and serenity will become possible. And he proposes one method that we can use. I thought it would be good to share as a practice that you can test in your daily living. What he suggests is to learn to think before we act. Okay, so you could say it is to consider first what comes first, then what are the consequences of my choices, and only then act. It is to cultivate this habit, or practice, perhaps is a better word, of surveying and testing prospective action before undertaking it. That is to say, to put it in the context of your own life, in the context of your own values and principles, and who you want to be and become, and only then to make a decision. And this would progressively help us to overcome the raw impulse. Because when we skip this step of thinking before we act or say, etc., is what can happen to us. We can engage quite enthusiastically with an endeavor, with a decision, but when the first challenges come, we lose that enthusiasm. It dissipates. And sometimes we can even regret our decisions, okay? Because we were never clear on why. And so he says and explains that as human beings, we shouldn't only follow that which seems interesting to us, that we are curious about, or that which at the time looks comfortable, okay? But to step back and think things through from the perspective of ideals that we have, okay? When we don't do so, he would say it's not a noble act to do, okay? But once we have examined our decision, okay, once we are clear on why we want to do what we have chosen to do, then another test is to commit fully to it, okay? So to accept everything that comes with that decision, not only what we need to do, but as well the consequences of this decision. And this will help us to feel less all over the place. Because when we don't go through this process, which, by the way, it's not overthinking, but putting things in the context of who you want to be and become, of your purpose in life, of your responsibility towards others and the world, and you're going to be able to make decisions much more clearly, okay? When we don't think things through in the context of our life, what happens to us is that we jump from one decision to another. And sometimes we jump from one thing to another without necessarily having an aim. Okay, so it's like more, I'm interested a little bit in this, and I'm interested a little bit in that, but these decisions are not really interconnected. Okay, and with this approach, we cannot develop our natural gifts of being a human being. Okay. So this leads me progressively to the conclusion, and the only thing that I'm going to use for that is the quote of Epictetus that I really consider sums it up well, which is, nothing truly stops us. Nothing truly holds us back, for our own will is always within our reach, within our control. So thank you very much for your attention.